I'm going to step in just for 1 minute and thank you for your patience with me. But Chris Lawrence asked me to substitute for Professor Whitford, who's running a little bit late this morning, and introduce Professor Davis of the University of North Carolina
At Greensburg.
at Greensburg. Thank you. Sorry about dropping off the G.
Well, it's nice to meet you all. Some of you I met yesterday, and for everyone in the meeting today, it's nice to meet you as well. As I said, I'm Chris Davis. I do research and teaching at UNCG in usually around the World War I era and the so-called banana wars of American interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean in the early 20th century. So yesterday, for those who were able to attend my presentation on the U.S. occupation of Haiti between 1950 and 1934, now I'm going to talk about that other thing that was happening around that time, World War I. And switching from Marine-centric, this one will be more Army-centric, as I will be focusing on the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. And this was the final major offensive of the war, and really the first one that the Americans, the only one where the Americans really get to take charge of the operation. And it keeps going all the way up until the armistice goes into effect. So this, by all accounts, is truly the last battle. And this comes from a chapter I recently wrote for Army University Press in their large-scale combat operations book series. The theme for this book was consolidation of gains. So I will be specifically focusing on how the AEF successfully, and in some cases unsuccessfully at first, but then was able to adapt how they were able to consolidate gains during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So first, let's go into what constitutes consolidation of gains. And the more recent definition of this can be found in the FM 3-0 operations. Consolidation of gains is considered essential to any operation. And really what we're talking about is an issue that can be argued came up a lot in conflicts like Vietnam and Afghanistan. You continuously win battles against the enemy, but you're not really taking any new territory. You're winning, but you're not consolidating any of those gains. And that's really important because you'll just keep fighting again and again with negligible results. As Patton famously said, I don't like fighting for the same real estate twice. Of course, Patton is actually at this battle. He's just a younger man at this point and hasn't become a household name, as he will in the next one. But consolidation of gains is considered essential to any operation. This involves the removal of the enemy's capability and will for further resistance. It is integral to winning armed conflict and achieving enduring success. It is the final exploitation of tactical success. And it must be initiated by frontline maneuver elements. Consolidation of gains operations are meant to capitalize on the gains made by the forward frontline maneuvering element. By definition, such operations do not occur in areas of close and large-scale combat. This is not the front line, but rather where security and stabilization are required to move the overall force forward. So behind the frontline elements are the elements that are trying to consolidate what they've achieved and make it work so the offensive can keep the momentum. So by those definitions, how well did the AEF perform during the Meuse-Argonne offensive? Overall, it was very successful in applying consolidation of gains. Could it have been better? Yes, and in the terms of there was probably an unnecessarily large loss of life on the side of the Americans, and a lot of this has to do with Pershing's views of how war is to be conducted, and I'll get into that in a moment. But where the AEF was most successful, at least in my mind, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, was in four key areas: establishing and maintaining lines of transportation and communication. That's absolutely essential, and the other three, honestly, are dependent on that first one. Clearing bypass enemy forces, often referred to as mopping up operations. Handling and interrogating of enemy prisoners of war. As this was key to both removing enemy combatants from the battlefield and gaining valuable intel about the German order of battle. And finally, providing medical services. This is a little more indirectly involved with the other three, but particularly within the Meuse-Argonne offensive, it becomes key to being able to keep the force moving forward. Medical services are important anyway, but in the fall of 1918, they became unexpectedly more dire. So, to put the Meuse-Argonne offensive in context. So, World War I, of course, starts in the very end of July, beginning of August, depending on which nation you were, of 1914. The United States is steadfastly neutral for the first few years of the conflict. However, as we all know, it eventually did get pulled into the conflict after several key events: the sinking of the Lusitania, which didn't bring the U.S. into the war, but unrestricted submarine warfare, while taken off the table for a time, was put back on as the British blockade around Germany and its allies was making supplies and food scarcer. In desperation, German U-boats resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against not just the British, but anyone traveling into what I consider enemy waters, whether they were neutral ships or not. More American ships were being sunk. And so that's where the Wilson administration switches to armed neutrality. Then the Zimmerman telegraph scandal, where a communique is intercepted between Germany and Mexico, promising, hey, you know all those territories you lost to the United States in the previous century? If you side with us, if America joins the war, we will ally ourselves with you to get those territories back. And the combination of these things was the final straw that brought the United States into the conflict in April of 1917. And given command of the American Expeditionary Force is General John, aka Blackjack Pershing. And he followed a typical World War I strategy that had been used throughout the beginning of the war, is try to break through the enemy defenses with overwhelming force, to which the other allies, the French and the British, are thinking, well, if only we had thought of that. Unfortunately, they had learned all too well that that doesn't really work, particularly in 1916. If they needed evidence before, the battles of Verdun and the Somme made it quite clear that no matter how much manpower you threw at the enemy, defenses would still hold, and you would not achieve a breakthrough so much as an endless bloodbath. And so the Allies settled into more of a war of attrition, just simply going on and seeing if who can bleed the other to death first. When the U.S. enters the war, it's Pershing and Wilson are under the impression that the reason that the Europeans have not been able to achieve a successful breakthrough is simply that they just weren't trying hard enough, that they didn't have that American can-do spirit. And to be fair, there's something to be said for American can-do spirit. I'm not discounting that, but they are talking to allies that had that same spirit at the beginning. The entire French war doctrine was based on the concept of élan, that fighting spirit, that victory would go to the side who wanted it bad enough. And it took 3 years and one indecisive battle after another to show them that that was not the way to go. However, By this point, all sides are wearing down, and there is something to be said for the greater enthusiasm that the AEF at this point has against the war-weary Germans. That if anyone actually wants to be here at this point, it's the American forces. Everybody else is just ready to go home. But that doesn't mean that Germany is ready to give up just yet. And so this leads to the American strategy here at the Meuse-Argonne, is that throughout the war, the way Germany was able to maintain its defenses was they had this massive railway network all along the Western Front. And so anytime the Allies put pressure, no matter how much, anywhere on the line, they could move their reserves quickly up and down to reinforce those positions. And so this prevented the Allies from ever achieving the major breakthrough, because Germany could always reinforce its positions, even in multiple places, very quickly. So the objective in the Meuse-Argonne offensive is to break through those enemy defenses and cut off the German railway system. By 1918, by that summer, the Allies had been achieving victories that had not been seen by either side for quite some time. It was scary in the spring of 1918 when Germany launched the Michael offensive, being able to pull troops from the Eastern Front that once Russia dropped out of the war. The Germans implied everything and the kitchen sink offensive against the Allies. And once again, for the first time since 1914, found themselves within miles of Paris again. By that point, Allied defenses were able to regroup. Germany was running out of steam, and the influx of American troops to reinforce the Allies along the Western Front stunted the Michael offensive. And through the summer of 1918, leading up to the beginning of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September, starting on September 26th, the Allies were able to push through with much greater gains than they had before. So they saw a real chance to break through in the Argonne Forest Meuse River Valley area, to break through and take control of the German railway system in that sector and essentially break Germany's back. Meanwhile, they're also throwing this massive force of Americans at one of the most heavily defended German positions along the Western Front. But they're hoping the manpower that the Americans have will be enough to draw what's left of the most intense German fighting to them, while British and French forces press against the less defended positions farther north. While attempts like that had failed in the past, this time all sides were wearing down to the point where this seemed like an achievable goal. And what ends up happening is this is an American-led offensive, but it does have the support of the French Fourth Army. And between allies, there was some coordination issues. To begin it with, everybody within the Allied powers was very happy that the United States had joined the war on their side. They were very happy to see that kind of fresh influx of troops to bolster their forces in a war that had clearly become a numbers game of who was just going to run out of people first. However, by the Allied stand, both the Americans and the other allies doubted each other's abilities. From the French and British perspective, the American army was very green in their eyes, and that's not entirely unfair. That when the United States declared war against Germany in 1917, it started with an army that was smaller than that of Belgium. And most, with exceptions like the Spanish-American War and the various banana wars of the Caribbean, most, like the last time the American army had really seen real combat had been the Civil War. So there certainly was a green aspect to the Americans. The Americans in turn doubted that their British and French counterparts, again thinking that, well, you just give up too easily. And in fact, there was a joke that among American troops at the time that AEF stood for after England failed. And so their attitude was, well, you just couldn't get the job done, so go ahead and sit down, we can take it from here. And so there was, it's one of those things that you can be allies without necessarily being friends. And so developing that friendship between allies was very important, and they didn't have a lot of time to make that happen. And to the Americans' credit, they did start with a force smaller than that of Belgium, but by the summer of 1918, the AEF force, overall forces had swollen to a size of 4 million. So when the Americans finally did show up, they showed up in force. There was also completely different training aspects, and this is where there probably was a larger loss of life on the American side than was entirely necessary, because by this point, the British and French have adapted to the realities of World War I. That they have, part of the reasons these offensives have been more successful these last few years is not just war weariness on both sides, but starting with Germany on the Eastern Front, and then quickly the British and French were able to apply it as well. The precision of artillery had improved since the beginning, even since the battles of Verdun and the Somme, to where they had perfected the art of the creeping barrage. That the war had been characterized by heavy use of artillery, with the idea that you could just blast the other enemy trench into oblivion, knock out all their barbed wires, all their defensive units, hopefully as many of the enemy as you can, but to bury them in their trenches so they can't just crawl up and man the defenses. And then you'd have your infantry charge across no man's land, which can often be up to a mile, to storm the enemy trench that they assume everybody is dead in after this massive artillery barrage. And it almost was never the case, that the artillery was usually defective. It wasn't very precise. It almost never cut the barbed wire the way they thought. And in the time it takes the infantry to run across no man's land, everybody's already gotten up out of their trenches, returned to their fully functioning defensive machine guns, and mowed down the opposing forces. And so by this point, by 1918, both sides have developed much more precise artillery and tactics that allow for a creeping barrage, where you are able to coordinate infantry and artillery to where you can have the artillery firing close enough, far enough ahead that's not going to hurt your own infantry, but close enough to once you stop firing, your infantry is already there, not allowing the enemy time to re-man their defensive positions. And so this was becoming much more effective, and the British and French were practicing joint training between artillery and infantry units. They were also using light howitzers because rather than the heavy artillery they had been using, because it was more mobile than what it was easier for them to move forward than to lug their 75s and 155s that they had used so much in earlier stages of the war. Pershing is still fighting largely from a Civil War mentality of heavy use of artillery and heavy artillery. So he's still using the French 75 and 155s. He believes that heavy artillery is the way to go, and he also doesn't emphasize any training between infantry and artillery. Instead, he focuses on individual training of marksmanship and aggressiveness. He's capitalizing on American enthusiasm and can-do spirit. The artillery will pummel the enemy. The American soldier will do the rest. And despite British and French commanders trying to tell him otherwise, there was he just didn't take the advice. And then on the other side, from the American perspective, there's a resistance to something that particularly the French are interested in. They really want to integrate American soldiers into their pre-existing units rather than have the Americans be an independent fighting force. Wilson and Pershing in particular are dead set against this. Because if nothing else, Pershing has learned from this war so far that the British and French approach of throwing manpower at the enemy only to get mowed down, in their mind, if they turn over American soldiers to be commanded by French and British commanders, then the American infantry is basically going to be cannon fodder, used as cannon fodder to help them in their numbers game. And so that's the main point that Pershing and Wilson are dead set against. And it comes down to Supreme Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch's call as to whether or not American forces are to be integrated with French and British units. And despite the wishes of Prime Minister Clemenceau, who was of France, who was very much in favor of integration, Foch decided against it. He went against his own government and decided that, particularly for this last battle, the Americans should be allowed to function as an independent force. His reasoning was that, in my experience, troops always do better under a commander who shares their culture, follows the same playbook, speaks the same language, and that mixing up against a multinational, multilinguistic force is going to cause problems. And so the compromise is twofold. One, there is limited integration where Pershing does allow African-American units to serve under French command. And that solves certain segregation issues that existed in the army at the time, but also fulfills promises that Pershing had made to the African-American community that African-American soldiers would be given the opportunity to see real combat. And they carried themselves with great distinction in battle at the Meuse-Argonne. And also, the Meuse-Argonne offensive will be a coordinated effort, but it will be of an American-led operation consisting of the American First Army. The American Second will join in later. And the American First Army will consist of the First, Third, and Fifth Corps, and all along this region here, and down here on the forest edge, the French Fourth Army will provide support, but it will be an American-led operation. So operations begin almost, we just passed the anniversary of it a few days ago, on September 26th, with the ambitious objective of seizing Montfaucon on day one of the operation. That's starting from here, that's all the way up here. This has been a prize that the French have been after since they first lost this position at the beginning of the war in 1914. It is the most heavily defended and most strategic spot in this entire region. And the Germans were able to seize this position and dug in hard from that point on. Multiple attempts have been made to retrieve it, knowing that this would regain Allied advantage in the region if they could get it back. Each attempt failed, but Pershing is determined not only to recapture it during the offensive, but to get it on the very first day. It is a very ambitious plan, and to be fair, he almost achieved it, but there were problems, and that's where consolidation of gains will come in. For one thing, in order to get ready for this operation, they had 2 weeks to move 1 million plus troops, including equipment and ammunition, etc., from the Saint-Mihiel salient all the way to Meuse-Argonne, and to do so quietly. Moving 1 million people is not something that you can do very quietly, even in 1918. So, and Among other logistical challenges, the biggest problem is traffic. As they had 2 weeks to launch this massive major offensive, they run into myriad traffic jams. Orders change back and forth as to when and how to move things. There's constant miscommunication. At points, communication just outright breaks down. And none of this affected Pershing's timetable. It doesn't even slow down his operation. He just tells them to press on. And George Marshall at the time has the unenviable task of making it happen. He does make it happen, and he becomes a very recognizable name after this war in the next one. And so this is where consolidation of Gates operations became essential to overcoming these issues. So not only were the roads getting to the launch site of the Meuse-Argonne offensive difficult, but moving forward once they were there was even more problematic. That you're talking about an area that it was forested, it was river valley, it had 3 roads. To be fair, it did have 3 roads in 1914. Since that time, those have been blasted into oblivion by artillery. And so there is nothing but this landscape that you see before you for the Allies to move forward against a deeply entrenched enemy. And so not just manpower moving forces, if you can't move not just reinforcements, but supplies, ammo, all the things you need to keep the fighting going after you've advanced, you need roads, you need railways. And not only do they supply the things I mentioned, but that's also how, particularly in 1918, those were the main lines of communication, are those roads and railways. So if you don't have them, you don't have the ability to move forward, you don't have to move anyone back if you need to. You don't have a way to get the supplies and ammo needed to the front. And you can't even maintain communication with the frontline units. And this results in events where entire units can go in the wrong direction and get isolated, which famously happened during this battle with the Lost Battalion. And along with this being a pockmarked crater zone over the last few years, they also are having to build these roads with artificial obstacles that have been put in to make sure enemy forces can't move easily across. These areas have been mined. There's shrapnel everywhere. It's just a mess. So it falls to the Army engineers to restore transportation and communication lines. So the siege of Montfaucon on day 1, they get close, to be fair, they get close. But according to Brigadier General Malin Craig, poor communication in a broken country is his best description for how the operation was going on day 1. The Army engineers are very early on, it's recognized that we have a problem and we need you guys to step in, and they do a great job, but it is a lot to do in one day. And so by the end of day 1, Montfaucon stays just out of the reach of the 79th Division. The 37th and the 4th are able to seize both flanking salients of Montfaucon, but the prize is just out of the 79th's grasp. And Army reports show that this was largely due to, it's not a lack of advancing, they were certainly moving forward, but heavy traffic congestion and delayed arrival of artillery, which was horse-drawn at the time, makes day 1's objective have to be a day 2 objective. And so day 2 of the offensive continues, and again, the AEF is successfully advancing. But in many ways, they're victims of their own success. They're moving faster. The frontline infantry is moving faster than reinforcements and supplies can keep up with it. And so artillery like 105s and 155s are delayed. So the infantry is outpacing their artillery support. So meanwhile, during all of this, the 104th Engineers out of the 29th Division have been working through the night. And so they do manage to get Meuse-Argonne, but they still have a long road ahead of them. As you can see, this is how far they get on day one. This is several days later, all the way into October. And Meuse-Argonne is a very early success. It starts slowing down because, quite frankly, they just can't keep advancing as long as these roads are unable to resupply and reinforce them. So by September 28th, the Army recognizes that enhancing road conditions are essential to the operation, that we cannot keep pressing forward unless we solve this problem. And so the 104th Engineers keeps working at it. By December 29th, reports show that the road situation has stabilized, and reports are consistent throughout the rest of the operation that this remains so, that it was an early challenge that the Army recognized, dealt with, and overcame in a matter of days, in less than ideal conditions, as if battle ever offered anything more than less than ideal conditions. But, and from this point on, they've got their momentum. They are keeping pace with frontline infantry. But those early days were messy, and as they are trying to build these roads, there is another significant problem, and that is mopping up operations. The enemy lines that can be broken or driven back, but a consolidation area is only secure once remaining enemy troops have been captured or killed. And so day two, as the 79th is pressing on Meuse-Argonne, represents a cautionary tale of what happens if you do not efficiently and effectively complete a mopping up operation. That as the 304th Engineers, just in the rear of the advance at the time, are working on these roads to help the front line advance, they find themselves under fire in an area that had already been declared as a mopped up area. That they are being fired at by German machine gun nests and from some of the most hardened divisions the Germans have, the 117th Division and the 7th Reserve. And so the engineers, the ones who are supposed to be working on the roads, are now taking fire from enemy machine gun nests. To their credit, they fire back and are not only able to clean out those nests themselves, but they take prisoners. But the point is, they should not have been in that position in the first place. And very quickly, the Army again learns from this early mistake that we cannot tolerate a declared mopped up area to be anything less than. So, and at least according to Army reports from the battle, an incident like this does not occur again. So again, rough start, but the AEF adapts. Which leads us into another important aspect of consolidating gains, and that is taking prisoners. This is another area where the AEF is almost a victim of its own success. That starting with the Battle of Cantigny earlier in 1918, the AEF finds itself taking far more prisoners, German prisoners, than they expected to. And the system that was in place on how to process and interrogate these prisoners was ineffective. That there was just too many, particularly when you fast forward to the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where AEF forces are capturing hundreds, if not thousands, of German prisoners by the day. And so the AEF transportation system, the one that was already being taxed by trying to reinforce, resupply, and the frontline forces, is now also having to process moving prisoners taken from the front line to the consolidated areas in the rear. So throughout the campaign. Nevertheless, this is not only essential for mopping up, it's important for intel because throughout the campaign, the German enemy prisoners of war are providing key intel on German order of battle, the location, the strength, and general disposition of those forces. And a good example of this, one of many, is that there was a very large German and determined German force that was waiting for the AEF in the Meuse because of German EPWs and the intel that was gathered from them. The American forces were prepared for them and were able to overcome the German forces that were lying in wait for them there. Nevertheless, to process all these prisoners, a new system had to be created. And the architect of this is Major Dennis Nolan from the AEF intelligence section. He recognized early on, even at Canton, that a new system and methodology for interrogating prisoners needed to be developed. And so at the beginning of American involvement on the battlefield, interrogation was always done by the lower echelons, and this was considered impractical and inefficient. And mainly because they had limited personnel for a task that had a lot of EPWs coming in and in an area of a high operating tempo. So Nolan institutes a more structured approach. EPWs at the front are disarmed. They're moved back to brigade headquarters to search for any smaller concealed weapons that the first group might have missed, and any documents they might be carrying that might provide valuable intelligence. From there, they sent further back to division enclosures under the Provost Marshal General, where they're interrogated by intelligence personnel there, and then they are escorted by PMG assigned personnel back farther to central enemy prisoner of war enclosures. And so there is a tiered approach to in which enemy prisoners of war are captured, disarmed, interrogated further, and interrogated once again by more and more professional interrogators. In fact, many of the personnel that was assigned to interrogating EPWs were hand-selected by the AEF based on their pre-war professions. Namely, they often got people who were lawyers before they became soldiers because they figured if anyone knew how to coax information out of an unwilling participant, it would be them. They also employed linguists as well. So finally, on the fourth area, there's medical services that are, and how they had to deal with both the usual battle triage, but having to fight another enemy that they didn't plan on. And that the Meuse-Argonne offensive is a case study of, for a lesson that we have sadly learned well in recent passage, is that the enemy that you're fighting is not always human. That in this case, a pathogen can be at least as deadly as the human forces that you're facing. So sadly, the AEF medical forces were largely unprepared even for traditional battle casualties. That first, there's the transportation issue, being able to move not just people forward, but injured soldiers back for medical treatment was difficult in the early days of these transportation issues. There's also a shortage of medical supplies. This was already evident just in the 2 weeks moving from the Seine Salient to the Meuse-Argonne region. But once they get there, not only are they dealing with large battlefield casualties, but the year of 1918 was also the beginning of the Spanish flu pandemic that would, even after the war is over, almost as if the war had an endless appetite for human lives, even after peace is declared, thanks to the flu, the Great War is still claiming lives by the millions. And some of the more conservative estimates say worldwide, 30 million people died from the flu. And to be honest, that's probably a low number. And considering the overall world population at the time, that was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. And the Great War did not help because it really starts surging in the fall of 1918. It starts hitting Allied and Central Power forces alike. Both sides kind of try to downplay how bad it is, but then the war is over, which is great, except armies from 5 continents that were all together in the same place, encountering the same pathogen, all just went back home. And they brought a souvenir from Europe with them. And so, though there is some debate as to whether Europe was actually the origin site of it, but that's a whole other argument. So, in most cases, at this point in history, the flu is not very well understood. They're not really sure how to treat it, particularly this version that does not function like a normal flu. Instead of targeting the young and the elderly, for some reason, this particular flu was extremely deadly to people otherwise in the prime of their life. So, which often left families with young children and elderly with no one able to care for them. So making it all the more tragic. So in most cases, the AEF medical services can only provide palliative care. At this point, viruses, there's still some debate on what a virus is, or even if that's a thing. They know for sure bacteria is a thing, but until the microscope is further developed by the 30s, whether the existence of an organism of the virus is still something of an academic debate. And so it's not a well understood disease. All they can provide is rest, keep them warm, feed them, and make sure they drink plenty of fluids, and hope they don't die. Nevertheless, the AEF medical services had to adapt, just like everyone. And so they developed lighter ambulances that will help travel on less than ideal road conditions, help them travel from and to the front. They developed these much more interconnected structures, these hospital cities. They're all different large field hospitals that are interconnected to each other, so they can separate different groups: lightly wounded, seriously wounded, gassed, psychiatric, and those who are sick, to make sure to limit the spread of the flu to other forces, because ultimately it's not only are they trying to make people better, but they also need to know who can go back to fighting as quick as possible and who legitimately needs to stay back longer. More serious patients were moved by railway to base hospitals farther back in the consolidation areas. And a lot of the problems came from the fact that they were understaffed. And this was largely because comes from complying with British and French wishes. That because the British and French, when the Americans provide their forces, they insisted on more infantry, more machine gun units, because that's what they really wanted. So they convinced the Americans to follow their percentage of overall force. And so America followed the British and French model of only having roughly 14% of your initial force of 1 million being medical personnel. And of course, that was not a good idea under ideal conditions. So when the flu hit, you were looking at, throughout the year in 1918, the AEF is suffering from a 25 to 30% shortage of medical personnel. And this is, during the course of this battle alone, 69,000 AEF soldiers were listed as sick. And that's probably low, because you'd have soldiers that either just didn't report that they were feeling ill. There were undoubtedly situations where they were probably encouraged not to report that they were sick, unless they were really sick. And then So to further counter this, First Army surgeons moved more and more experienced surgeons to forage triage stations to identify who could return to their units within 3 days. And so while not directly involved in consolidation of Danes operations, medical services were directly impacted by the success of transportation, communication, reestablishment, the movement of EPWs that did not conflict with medical movements, and mopping up operations. All of these feed into each other. So treatment of wounded and quarantine would be effective and ensured that the AEF could advance forward without rotting from behind. So in conclusion, if we were to give a report card to the AEF during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, you see that they have proven adaptability is key. The ability to adapt to secure freedom of movement and consolidation of Danes areas is essential to a successful outcome. The AEF quickly adapted to the challenges presented at the offensive's onset. They ran into some heavy problems early on, but within a matter of days, they have addressed them and they managed to continue to adapt and keep pace. And then finally, the AEF, with French support, did break through all the way to the German railway line only days before the armistice ended. And had Germany's war machine not been already on the verge of collapse as it was, if it had lasted longer, it's almost certain that the Meuse-Argonne offensive would have still been a successful breakthrough and broken the German railway system. And if not knocking them out of the war completely, it would have been a crippling blow.